Hi guys, we're back to talk more about nutrient cycling, and this time we're going to focus on nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle. So here we are with the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen, which has a chemical symbol of N, is another important nutrient in the environment. And like carbon, it comes in many forms. It comes in inorganic forms as well as part of organic compounds. So things like protein or DNA have lots of different N atoms inside of them. But there's also inorganic forms. So by far and away, the most common one is N2, which is two nitrogen atoms bonded together to form a nitrogen gas molecule. And there's also things like ammonia, or nitrate or nitrite, which are other kind of inorganic forms of nitrogen that are found in the environment. So this little diagram here shows about a lot of the cycling that goes on. So we have N2, nitrogen gas, up in the environment, and then it shows some of these nitrogen fixation processes that we'll talk more about on the next page. And then we have these other nitrogen transforming processes that can also happen with like soil bacteria and nitrifying and denitrifying bacteria, et cetera, and then assimilation or uptake of nitrogen by organisms to form these organic compounds like amino acids, proteins, et cetera, and then kind of recycling of all that material. So this is just kind of illustrating some pathways and then, different kinds of forms of nitrogen that we might find in the environment. So when we've gone through these nutrient cycles, we've kind of thought about where these things exist, what reservoirs they exist in, and then what their residence or turnover times might be. So the atmosphere is far and away the biggest reservoir of nitrogen. So lots and lots of nitrogen. And once it gets up there, it stays there for a really long time, like millions of years. We also have lots of nitrogen in sediments and soils and can also stay there on kind of a millions of year time scale. Then we have different forms of either mostly organic or mostly inorganic, but also organic nitrogen in the oceans, and then in soils, and then biomass, marine biomass, et cetera. So basically, as I already said, the biggest component is nitrogen in the atmosphere, but as we'll learn on the next page, that particular form of nitrogen gas in the atmosphere is not a form that's bioavailable, meaning that organisms can't utilize that, or most all organisms can't utilize that to make different kinds of organic compounds with nitrogen that we need. And so there's an important pathway, or a couple different important pathways that can transform that nitrogen gas into this different bioavailable form. So nitrogen fixation is kind of the name for that process of taking that atmospheric N2 and turning it into a bioavailable form. Most commonly, this is done by turning it into NH4, so one nitrogen with four hydrogens, which is called an ammonium ion. So it has a charge, which is why it's an ion. It has a plus charge here. I guess I didn't write that down. But it's closely related to ammonia, which you're probably familiar with. It has like a smell, it's a cleaning product. So anyway, that's a bioavailable form that then can be utilized by other organisms. And so we'll come back to this page in a minute, but let me skip over to do a deeper dive on this really important nitrogen transformation process, again called nitrogen fixation. So 78% of our atmosphere is this N2 gas, but as we've already said, it's not bioavailable. So nitrogen fixation converts this form of nitrogen into a form that's accessible by living organisms. And typically it transforms nitrogen gas into, as we already said, NH4 plus, which is ammonium. And then there's other pathways usually involving bacteria that can then continue to transform ammonium into nitrite or nitrate, which are also different bioavailable forms. And so if you have fertilizers that you're putting on your crops, they're often going to be nitrate, but they could have other nitrogen forms as well. And that's because those are bioavailable forms that are necessary to support plant growth, even though plants are surrounded by nitrogen gas. So this fixation process can happen through a couple different pathways. The first way and the most common natural way is through microbes, so certain kinds of cyanobacteria, which are sometimes referred to as blue-green algae, have the ability to make this chemical reaction happen inside their bodies. And they're the only organisms that have the ability to do this. And these organisms, these cyanobacteria, often have symbiotic relationships with other organisms in the environment. Specific plants are sometimes referred to as like nitrogen fixing plants. And in fact, the plants themselves are not actually fixing nitrogen, but they have kind of communal living situations with the nitrogen fixing microbes, usually in little nodules on their roots. So things like legumes, which are like peas, or like naturally things like lupin, other ceanothus plants that grow around here. A lot of the shrubs that grow around in our forest can do that. Certain kinds of organisms in the rose family can do this. So those plants have these relationships with these nitrogen fixing bacteria. And so when those plants are growing in a location, then we're having this natural kind of self-fertilization process that's going on around those plants. Another natural pathway that can occur to allow the creation of bioavailable nitrogen is through lightning. When lightning strikes, it can heat up the nitrogen in the atmosphere enough to transform it into bioavailable forms. The other two forms or the other two pathways are particular pathways that are created artificially by humans. And so the first one is through the combustion of fossil fuels. So when we burn fossil fuels, one of the things that we create as a byproduct are different kinds of what are sometimes referred to as NOx gases. So these are nitrogen and oxygen combined, or with different numbers of oxygen. So this could be like NO2, NO3, and those are forms of like nitrates and nitrites that are bioavailable forms. So when we have exhaust coming out of the, pipe on the back of our car, the exhaust pipe, or out of a factory, we are kind of transforming some of these inorganic forms of nitrogen by combining them with atmospheric nitrogen gas and then creating fixed nitrogen or bioavailable forms. And then that's kind of like an incidental byproduct of human activity, but we also have a very intentional way that we create bioavailable forms of nitrogen in the synthetic creation of different fertilizers. This is a very energy intensive process. And there's a particular process called the Haber-Bosch process that is basically allows us with lots and lots of heat energy to transform inorganic forms of nitrogen into forms of nitrogen. And this was actually a process that we learned about when we were trying to make explosives during kind of the World War era. And so it kind of came out of that research and development technology. So it has a little bit of a soiled past. But this is still a process that we use to make a lot of industrial synthetic fertilizer. And it, when there's too much of this in the environment, it can create lots of environmental hazard problems. And as we also said, it's a big energy sink. So there's some concerns about the process that we'll talk more about later on in the class. But anyway, these are the 4 pathways that we can fix nitrogen, which again means taking inorganic nitrogen, unbioavailable nitrogen, and turning it into a bioavailable form. So let's back up for a second. So that's all about this first process, fixation. But then we said there's other kinds of usually microbial driven pathways that can continue to transform the ammonium, which is usually created through the fixation, into other forms like nitrite, which is NO2, and nitrate, and both of those have negative charges overall. And then there's also different pathways where bacteria are able to turn nitrate back into N2 gas, and which is called a denitrification process. And this is something that particularly happens in kind of oxygen-starved environments. So the bacteria are trying to extract the oxygen from that NO3 compound so that they can use it for respiration, and then they spit out the extra nitrogen. So oxygen-starved environments are usually like aquatic environments, wet, soggy, boggy environments, where the oxygen in the air is not really easily accessed by living organisms. So anyway, these are three main pathways that kind of move and transform nitrogen around in the environment. Okay, so how are humans shifting the nitrogen cycle? Well, as we already said, humans have found a couple different ways, like the Haber-Bosch process, to kind of synthetically produce lots of bioavailable nitrogen, about 500 million tons each year. Here's a big fertilizer production plant. That's photographed. That happens to be down in Florida. And about 2% of humans' energy budget goes into fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer production. And so we've doubled the amount of bioavailable nitrogen that's cycling in the environment in the last like 70, 80-ish years that we've had this technological capacity. NOx gases, which we said are products of combustion of fossil fuels, which we use to fuel all kinds of things in factories and of course fuel transportation. That is something that's also increased dramatically, even much more than just general bioavailable nitrogen. It's increased by about 7 times since the Industrial Revolution. And that is problematic because we'll talk more about this later when we talk about the atmosphere and atmospheric pollutants. But one, it's a greenhouse gas. It's a form of greenhouse gas. And also, it's an atmospheric pollutant that has different kinds of other kind of health hazard concerns. And also, it breaks down the ozone. So that's another thing we're not that into. Anyway, so just like in the other cycles, humans, as we are exploding in our population and figuring out new technologies and manipulating our environment, we're changing the way that nutrients are stored and cycled in our environment. And that's not always all bad, but it's good to be aware of and definitely can have some kind of undesirable consequences. Okay, I think that's where we're going to stop. Oh, I guess I have a note about ammonia as well. Increased by 3 times, affects air quality and acid rain. So also not good things. And again, we'll talk about all this a little bit more later on in the class when we talk about atmospheric pollution. Okay. Oh, never mind. Let's talk about nitrates too. So nitrates, remember, are the NO3 compounds. So the NOx gases in the air are usually more like NO and NO2 compounds. The ammonia that we talked about on the last page is the NH3 or NH4 is ammonium compound. So nitrates are the NO3 compounds. And nitrates are one of the major polluters in our environment. And again, we'll talk a lot more about this once we talk to atmospheric pollution and a lot about water pollution. One major human health concern about the presence of nitrates in drinking water is something that's called blue baby syndrome. So when we drink water, whether that's surface water or groundwater that has too many nitrates in it, and that might be from fertilizer runoff or from kind of leaching of like sewage or kind of like large animal, confined animal production areas into groundwater. And then if we're drinking that groundwater, we might get too much nitrates in our body. And then that impacts the ability of our blood, the hemoglobin in our blood, to work properly to move oxygen around in our blood. And so this can create lots of health problems and is particularly risky for young children. So there's a syndrome called blue baby syndrome, where babies start literally turning blue when they're drinking water with too many nitrates in it because they are lacking oxygen, and obviously can be very critical. It's less likely for older adults and humans to have such a critical kind of like literally suffocating reaction, but it can definitely create long-term health impact. So not something that we want to be exposed to. And then another thing that we'll talk a lot more about later on in the class is a process that's called eutrophication. So eutrophication is a process where ecosystems respond to the addition of excess nutrients into aquatic systems. So this can be excess nitrogen in the form of nitrates, or also phosphorus in the form of phosphates. And when these extra nutrients get into these aquatic systems, if these nutrients were previously the limiting factor, remember we talked about Liebig's law of the minimum, then all of a sudden algae can grow faster than it was previously able to grow. And at first you might think like, oh, well, isn't that a good thing? We'd have more productive aquatic systems. But it's not always good if the algae really starts to grow very, very quickly. First of all, some of the kinds of algae that can rapidly take advantage of these increases in the nutrients may actually have toxic byproducts. So there can be very direct negative impacts on water. Also, it can deplete like light coming into the water. So for certain native organisms, that might be a problem. But usually one of the biggest problems is that algae is actually fairly short-lived. And so as this algae is blooming or lots of algae is growing, also this algae is dying. And then there'll be a similar bloom of lots and lots of microbes that start springing up to eat and feed on this algae. And those microbes are using up lots of oxygen from the water and able to be able to live. And so they start depleting the environment of oxygen. And then we start to have die off of lots of other organisms that are being suffocated due to the big kind of drop off in the oxygen content in the water. So this is not good. This is not something that we want to see. And we'll talk about this process more later when we get into water and issues with water quality later on in the class. Okay, there we go. Finally, a stopping point.